Welcome to this month's book talk. I'm Andrew Cohn, and this month we're talking about a wonderful book called You're Not Listening: What You're Missing and Why It Matters by Kate Murphy. Wonderful journalist, lots of good stories to share, best practices, and really she makes a compelling case for the importance of listening. Really good practical book and an easy read, I think. Also good for sharing with colleagues and loved ones as well. And the book looks like this. I have a photograph of it in there for you. Sometimes people have shared with me that I'm not sure if it's exactly the same book as what I've seen before. So that's why I put this in here as a reference. I've learned that over the years. Um, there are a number of important themes of this book, and I'm not going to try to talk about all of them just in the interest of time and focus. My interest is really about leadership development, and that's what I'm focusing on is on listening as a leader and in a, if you will, a leader-like way, listening to customers, listening to peers, listening to team members. And there's other things in here, for example, on listening to opposing points of view as in political differences. There are some other themes. Actually, let me get to the list of themes now. And then we'll share really what my focus is. So the themes in this book, as I distill it, are why listening is important, the neuroscience of listening, what gets in the way of listening, how we can listen better, when to stop listening, a fascinating little topic, because she's promoting and advocating active listening, committing to building our skills to be better listeners. But when is it just time to walk away? And the mechanics of sound, another fascinating chapter. And also the morality of listening is a title of one of the chapters. Very interesting. But I'm really going to focus on number 1, number 3, and number 4, why listening is important, what gets in the way, and how we can listen better. Because from my standpoint and for my clients, that I think is what's most important, but all interesting, all useful in this book. And I would start with a quotation from the book that says, listening isn't simply about holding your peace while someone else holds forth. Quite the opposite. A lot of listening has to do with how you respond, the degree to which you elicit clear expression of another person's thoughts, and in the process, crystallize your own. So what she's saying is the measure of effective listening is how well we can elicit clear expression of another's thoughts. Listening is about helping someone else clearly communicate, in addition to whatever value might be held with our understanding what that person is saying. So it's quite interesting, I think, to frame it that way. She says to listen poorly, selectively, or not at all is to limit your understanding of the world and deprive yourself of becoming the best you can be. So the stakes are high. That's why listening is important. Listening is important because digital distraction is epidemic. In our current culture, as she says, people get jittery without their phones, like they're patting their pockets to see where their packet of cigarettes are. Our phones are like our cigarettes. It's our addiction, driven by, as she says, fear of missing out. This prevents sustained attention, which makes listening difficult. Really, it makes difficult anything that requires focused thought. Research conducted by Microsoft found that since the year 2000, the average attention span has dropped from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. And just for context, a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. Now, I knew this as a fan of Ted Lasso, if that means something to you, this particular show. But goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds, and ours is now shorter. And digital distraction is a key part of this, Research has shown that the mere presence of a phone on the table, just to be able to see a phone on the table when two people are talking, even if the phone is silent, makes people sitting around the table feel more disconnected and disinclined to talk about anything important. So if I'm listening to you and I see your phone over there, I'm going to be wondering if you're going to be seeing something from that phone or be distracted by that phone. I'm distracted by the phone. The phone hasn't done anything. It's just anticipatory distraction, if you will. And that may prevent me from focusing as well as I can on you. It may prevent you from sharing something as important or meaningful or deep as you otherwise would if you had my full attention. The mere presence of the phone, even if it's not on, just having it in the corner of our eye, which is why just before I started this, I placed my phone behind my monitor because I didn't want to have the potential of feeling distracted. So I know this book is about listening, but it's really about how we use our attention. It's really about how we use our attention. So digital distraction is epidemic. And one thing I want to say before getting to point number two is speaking, there's a lot of research in this book, and the book's organized in a good way where the research is in the back of the book, organized by the chapter in which the research is featured. So you can read the book. It's a very clear, straightforward, fairly easy read. And the references and the citations are not a distraction because they're in the back of the book. So I like that she did it that way. Second point, listening is a gift we all need and deserve to receive. As she says, listening is not about teaching or shaping, critiquing, appraising, or showing how something should be done. It's about the experience of being experienced by another person. She says what makes us feel most lonely and isolated in our lives is less often the result of a devastating traumatic event than the accumulation of occasions when nothing happened, but something profitably could have happened. It's the missed opportunity to connect when you weren't listening or when someone wasn't really listening to you. And seen that way, listening really is a gift. She also noted, interestingly enough, that evolution gave us eyelids so we can close our eyes, but there's no corresponding structure to close off our ears. So perhaps our ears are essential, perhaps more essential than our eyes, to our survival. I think that's interesting. And speaking of deserving, she also talks about how we are biologically wired to respond to other voices. There's research about babies and how babies respond to human voices in different ways than they respond to other sounds. When we listen to other people, our brain waves align. We literally sync up with other people, and brain research shows that syncing up with our patterns. Brain waves are powerful indicators of understanding in connection with others. And when listening closely to someone, there is overlap between the speaker's brain activity and the listener's brain activity. The more we listen to someone and the more that person's listens to you, literally, the more there will be like minds measurable by brainwave research. That's what's at stake here. That's what's possible. That's the connection that we can have by listening. So let's get to the second key idea here. What gets in the way of listening? So the first is digital distraction. So we talked about, I talked about that mobile phone thing, which is just critically important. Digital distraction keeps the mind occupied, but it does little to nurture it, much less cultivate depth of feeling. Depth of feeling requires the residence of another's voice within our very bones and psyches. To really listen is to be moved physically, chemically, emotionally, and intellectually by another person's narrative. Digital distraction prevents that. According to the author, our human brains are not equipped to manage the onslaught of stimuli in our attention economy. We know this, right? Things are getting faster. There's more and more stimuli. Think about our levels of how our senses, how our brains have developed, say in the last 100 years compared to the onslaught of stimuli. And I've talked about this before. I talked about this in the Thrive book talk, and I think one others as well. Remember that advertisers pay billions to media companies to steal us away from whatever else we might want to focus on. Over the last century, the average amount of time people have devoted to listening to one another has been cut from about 42% to 24%. Digital distraction. Our world is making it more difficult for us to focus. This chapter of the book also talks about the importance of our physical environments. And do they enhance our ability to listen and focus, or do they detract from that? She talks about workplaces are often open office designs, and open office designs have their own challenges in terms of distractions. That also has a lot to do with personality styles. I remember doing some work with a big consumer products company who was at the forefront of open office. And what they found is that it became really, really troubling and unproductive for large portions of the workforce. And we needed to develop some operating norms and understand the particular styles of different portions of the workforce to see how to design that office to really work for them, even though it was well intentioned. So Second point, what she calls the closeness communication bias. And what that means really is that we don't listen to the ones who matter the most. There is an implicit bias. So this is how this works. As she says, the most common refrains in close relationships are "I love you," followed closely by "You're not listening, let me finish," or "That's not what I said." As she says, relationships can grow stale, and that's because we don't take the time to listen. We think we know all there is to know. And whether that's with our partner, spouse, our kids, we think we know what there is to know. And we stop listening as intently as we would listening to someone new. And that's called the closeness communication bias. She says, for example, spouses answer questions for each other, finish each other's sentences, make decisions for each other, and they may, relatedly, they may give gifts that miss the mark. Um, she says, as wonderful an intimacy as and familiarity are, they can make us complacent. They can make us complacent. She said, often if there's a misunderstanding in a close relationship, it's because someone has stopped listening and listening effectively. And in order to overcome this bias, remember that no one is the same today as they were yesterday. Opinions and attitudes, beliefs and experiences change. We need to engage in curiosity and avoid growing complacent in our relationships. And I'll talk about curiosity in a few minutes. So the book provides some good relationship advice. She says, relying on the past to understand someone in the present is doomed to failure. How long would you want to stay with someone who is treating you as the person you were yesterday, as opposed to the person you are today? I think that's interesting. She said, even toddlers object to being treated like the infants they were just months earlier. Listening is how we stay connected and how we stay current with one another as the pages turn in our lives. So beware of the closeness communication bias that gets in the way of listening. The next point is what she calls the speech thought differential, which gets in the way of listening. And the speech thought differential is the difference in speed between how we think and what we can say or what another can say. Thoughts move faster than words. That's the speech thought differential. The average person speaks about 120 to 150 words per minute, which takes up only a tiny fraction of our mental bandwidth. We can think much, much faster than that. And so lacking sufficient stimulation, or what we feel or are habituated as sufficient stimulation, our minds tend to wander because we think faster than we can talk. We think faster than the other person is talking. And therefore, our minds tend to wander, and that gets in the way of listening. It makes perfect sense that that would happen. It's a biological reality, right? But as she says, to be a good listener means using your available bandwidth not to take mental side trips, but rather to double down on your efforts to understand. Listening well is a matter of continually asking yourself if people's messages are valid and what's their motivation. And again, what she's saying here is not from a skeptical point of view. What's their motivation? But rather, oh, I want to understand what's their motivation. It's helpful to think of listening as similar to meditation, right? You make yourself aware of what you're thinking, pay attention to it, and then double down and refocus on listening to that person. And then she continues, perhaps the greatest barrier to keeping our minds on track and following someone's narrative is the nagging concern about what we're going to say when it's our turn, right? So we're often thinking of what we're going to say, or as I've heard it said, we're reloading as opposed to listening. And that nagging concern, there may be insecurity around that. Well, I want to say the right thing. I want to seem knowledgeable. I want to seem attentive. All of that is a distraction. That's my mental narrative as opposed to listening to what the person is saying. Right? It's interesting. The more we think about the right thing to say as opposed to listening, the more we can miss of what the other person's saying. And the more likely it is that we'll say the wrong thing when it's our turn. Better to take in everything the other person has to say. And then if you need to, pause to formulate a good response. It's perfectly fine, as the author says, it's perfectly fine to say, I don't know what to say, if that's the truth, or to say, I'd like some time to think about that, which honors the other person and also respects the pace of communication and keeps me free to listen effectively as opposed to planning the response, right? So when there is that speech thought differential and our mind is going in a different direction, what could we do to minimize internal thoughts? And I'll talk in a little bit about what we can do, but this one I think is really important to tee up early in this talk. Self-awareness is critical, she said. People with a high degree of self-awareness are better listeners, in part because they know what makes them jump to their own conclusions. They know where they tend to be bored. They know where they tend to feel insecure about a response. How am I going to be able to do this? Am I going to say something impressive or intelligent, or will I get that person's approval? I can be aware of that. Self-awareness is really helpful. So this is about self-monitoring, as Ms. Murphy describes in the book. I'm monitoring my own level of distraction as I'm listening to you. Really, really important. Cultivating self-awareness means paying attention to your emotions during conversations and recognizing when fears or sensitivities may hijack your ability to listen well. Self-awareness, really, really important. And ultimately, as she says, you can only be as intimate with another person as you are with yourself. Am I listening to my own reactions? Am I listening to the signals that indicate when I'm getting off track or when I'm losing my focus? And that's about self-awareness. And that is how we can overcome the speech thought differential because our thoughts are moving much faster. The fourth way in which, or the fourth thing that gets in the way of listening is conflicting thoughts that feel like a threat to us, right? So in other words, I'm hearing something that sounds like a threat, and that's going to impact my ability to listen to those things. Neuroscientists at USC recruited subjects with staunch political positions and looked at their brain activity when their ideas were challenged. Part of their brains lit up as if they were being chased by a bear. So this is a fascinating piece of back to essentially like an amygdala hijack. The part of our brains that are perceiving a threat can't distinguish between being chased by the bear and having our identity or ideas threatened by what someone else is saying. So when something feels like a threat, it's very difficult to listen. How can I listen when I'm literally feeling afraid, right? So what do I need to do to calm myself down, to get myself present so that I can listen? But to recognize this is going to happen because our neurobiology is going to trigger that response if I feel threatened. So the author talks about negative capability or cognitive complexity. I wasn't familiar with these terms before. Namely, the ability to hold uncertainties and doubts in your mind without being irritated by the lack of certainty. So to hold these ideas, these uncertainties and doubts in our mind, it's like that old adage about wisdom being the ability to hold competing thoughts in our mind at the same time. That's what this is. Can we develop the ability to hold these things and be less certain and therefore continue to listen, feel less threatened by the uncertainty? So those would be the four things that really get in the way of listening. And the book does an excellent job of describing what they are, as well as how to respond to them. In large part, when I talked about the no phones and what that means, I will often start my team meetings by putting a bucket in the middle of the table and saying, do we need to use this bucket? Do you know what this is for? And everybody knows. It means put your phones away or else they're going in the bucket because they're just a huge distraction. We know that. Can we cultivate the discipline to really live without them during the time that we want to be listening? So how can we listen better? First point, make space for conversation. And that means not just making time, but making space and creating an environment for listening. So as she says, busy offices and homes discourage quality conversation. The more sensory input there is, the more stimulation, the more distracting, the harder it is to listen. And the phones are the biggest distraction, but there's a number of other things as well. Music. She talks about how music is turned up in certain environments, car dealerships, furniture dealers. It makes the brain go faster. It prompts impulse buying. It interferes with reflection and listening to ourselves and also listening to each other. Make space for communication. And there was another point about this that I wanted to. It's not that you can only effectively and meaningfully interact with people in a secluded or soundproof space. But what you can do is wave someone into your office and put your computer to sleep. You can choose quiet restaurants as well as silence your phone and put it away. You can find a park bench, take a walk on a quiet street, or just duck into a doorway, removed from the stream of pedestrian traffic, to have a word with someone. All of these are ways to not only listen better yourself, but to signal to the other person your willingness to listen to them, right? I don't know how many times have you walked into someone's office back in the day when we were walking into offices, and someone was on the phone, and you saw them hang up the phone and turn to listen to you as opposed to, oh, hold on just a second, they're distracted, but just hang up the phone. And that indicates I'm here for you completely, right? So what can we do to create space for conversation that conveys that message? Whether the conversation is long or short, about business or more personal, contentious or sedate, if we offer a quiet moment or a quieter moment in the surrounding chaos, we create a better opportunity to connect with that person and understand where they're coming from. So make space for conversation. Point 2, curiosity. As the author says, everyone is interesting if you ask the right questions. Everyone is interesting if you ask the right questions. If someone is dull or uninteresting, it's on you, she says. Research showed that when talking to inattentive listeners, so when someone is speaking to an inattentive listener, that speaker remembered less information and was less articulate in the information they conveyed. Okay, just by virtue of perceiving an inattentive listener. Conversely, attentive listeners elicited more information, relevant detail, and elaboration from speakers, even when the listeners didn't ask any questions. Just by being more attentive in their presence, they elicited more. So if you're barely listening to someone because you think that person is boring or not worth your time, you will actually make it so. In other words, an attentive listener changes the quality of the conversation. And curiosity is a big part of that. Lean in, be curious. That will, according to the research, that will change the way someone speaks to you, the level of detail, the depth, and the quality of the conversation and the quality of the presentation. Try to find out what excites the other person. Ask questions about why something is important to them. Tell me more about whether it's important to you. When did you first become interested in this, etc.? If it's something they're passionate about, it will be interesting. If it's something that they're passionate about, it will be interesting. And then she has this wonderful quote from Dale Carnegie. You can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. Now, very importantly, in terms of curiosity, she talks about the types of questions that people can ask. As she says, peppering people with personal questions or appraisal questions, as if you're appraising the other person. Questions like, what do you do for a living? Or what part of town do you live in? Or which school did you go to? That's more like interrogating. That's not really listening. That's getting information, which may be important, but it's different than listening. All right? Those questions are not about getting to know someone. It's about sizing them up. Curious people are fascinated by, rather than fearful of, the unpredictability of others. They listen well because they want to understand, to connect and grow. So don't size them up. Ask questions about what's important to them and really get underneath why it's important to them. As she says, you're the detective, always asking, why is this person telling me this? Speakers themselves may not even know the answer to a question. Good listeners help speakers because by asking questions and encouraging elaboration, like how do you know if you've succeeded as a listener if you're asking questions or encouraging elaboration? And you know you've succeeded when after the other person responds, they say something like, or after a question you ask, they say something like, yes, yes, you got it, exactly right. That's how you know you're successful, right? And this to me is a combination of listening with the head to the details of what they're saying, listening to the heart, to the emotion behind what they're saying and the feelings behind what they're saying, and then listening with your gut as well. What's their motivation? What are their fears? What are their hopes? And listening for that as well. So we're listening on all three of those levels very, very importantly. JP Morgan famously said, "A man always has two reasons for what he does, a good one and the real one." Listening helps you understand people's mindsets and motivations, which is essential in building cooperative and productive relationships, and also helps you know which relationships are better off avoiding. This is all about curiosity. Third way we can listen better is by supporting, not shifting the conversation. This is a very important and practical conversation. This is something, since I read this book, I've been focusing on doing in my own primary relationship and with my son as well. How can I listen in a way that's supportive? So there's two types of responses in conversation: shift responses and support responses. Shift responses direct attention away from the speaker and toward the listener or toward the respondent. And support responses encourage elaboration from the speaker. I'm supporting him or her to continue speaking, get to better detail, and gets to a better understanding. Now, good conversations are a combination of supporting and shifting, but the depth comes from the supporting. The deeper listening comes from the supporting. The deepening of the relationship often comes from the supporting. So the example is, John says, "My dog got out last week and it took 3 days to find him." Mary says, "Our dog is always digging out under the fence, so we can't let him out unless he's on a leash." That's a shift response. Mary made it about her dog, right? Let's try this again. John says, "My dog got out last week. It took 3 days to find him." Mary says, "Oh no, where'd you find him?" That's a support response. Tell me more about your experience. Tell me more about your experience. Now, remember that support responses are about the person speaking, and they're about building understanding. They have to be truly curious questions meant to elicit more information and not simply impose your opinion. Like, for example, didn't it piss you off when that person did that? That's not really a question. That's a closed ended question that's about my opinion as opposed to listening to what their experience was. So, if we want to ask more useful and supportive questions, those are questions. Those are not questions like, "Don't you think? Isn't it true? Wouldn't you agree?" etc. Right? They're more supportive questions. Tell me more. How is that important to you? What was your experience? How did you feel? Etc. It's about you, the speaker. It's not about me, the listener. And Murphy also notes, I think really importantly, the worst questions are the ones that weren't asked. If we're not willing to ask questions because we don't want to appear naive or lacking knowledge, we're self-conscious about speaking to this person about this topic for a variety of reasons. So we don't ask, and that we're reticent to ask questions. As she says, things go by you and you don't exactly know what was meant, but you let it go because maybe it's not important and you don't know, you don't want to show that you don't know, or you feel embarrassed, right? So be willing to ask questions. And she says another reason people don't ask questions and offer a more supportive response in listening is because they may be anxious about the answer. So maybe the conversation is going to go into some emotional territory or something like that. I don't know if I'm really prepared to handle this. And she encourages us to be adventurous as listeners. Be willing to go there. Be willing to go where the conversation leads, even if we're not sure exactly where it's going to lead, and even if it's uncomfortable, to be brave in our listening. Fourth way we can listen better is minding our internal dialogue. This goes back to that earlier point about the speech thought differential. The internal dialogue is more likely to go off track or become distracted or stop listening to the other person because we're thinking faster than the speech is happening. But as she says, it's very important to listen to what she calls the voluble inner voice. And there's a lot of inner voices in our heads. It could be the person who was talking about a topic this person is now speaking to me about. So the last time I heard about this topic was with this other person. My mind goes to that other person. Or an inner narrative about what I think about this topic or what I think about that other person. That's what's going on in my head. As she says, how you talk to yourself affects how you hear other people. If I have a critical inner voice, I'm going to hear someone else's words, particularly about certain topics. I'm going to hear someone else's words very differently than if my inner voice tends to be encouraging. So my internal dialogue influences and distorts what other people say and how I behave in relationship. It's very interesting, I think. Is your inner voice friendly? Is your inner voice critical? And maybe that inner voice switches from one to the other depending upon who that person is that you're listening to, who they remind you of, what the topic is, etc. All important to pay attention to this. Very, very important to pay attention to this. Again, it's about self-awareness, tuning into ourselves, and really being willing to be quiet and pay attention to what's happening inside ourselves. And if you've been listening to me over the years, you know that's a key theme of mine. Quieting down so we can listen and we can hear what's happening, not just with others, but with ourselves as well. So pay attention to what's happening and be willing to have a dialogue with ourselves about this topic, right? So that we can listen better to others. She says, as difficult as a problem may be, having a dialogue with yourself is ultimately the only way to solve it, or at least to come to terms with it. So be willing to have that inner dialogue. Mind your inner dialogue, not just in the conversation, but even offline. Wow, I noticed I reacted to that. I'm gonna pay some attention to that. I'm gonna do some journaling about it. I'm gonna talk to my coach about it, whatever it might be. So be willing to mind our inner dialogue and clean that up so that we can listen better. And the fifth point about how we can listen better, also related to tuning in, is embracing silence. As Ms. Murphy says, awkward silence can be a good thing. So-called awkward silence can be a good thing. She said in most Western cultures, people abhor silence. They call it dead air, literally dead air. These breaks in conversation that rarely last long. She says we tend to fill them with stories and questions and things that are funny and other thoughts and comments. Gaps in conversations can be as short as the blink of an eye or even less so before most of us will jump in. And there are certainly cultural differences around the world as well. Where in certain parts of the world are people naturally going to allow more gaps in conversation? That's a cultural reality, of course. But even though there's that tendency to rush in and to hate the silence, we need time to form our responses. Jumping in too quickly keeps us from fully expressing our ideas and can also lead to costly mistakes. And sometimes allowing a pause is just an act of service to the other person. They need to gather their thoughts. They need to think before they respond. And if I jump in and interrupt, I don't give them that respect and that opportunity to think and respond. We don't want to reload. We want to listen. She says, it took me too long as a journalist to realize that I didn't need to say anything to keep the conversation going. Some of the most interesting and valuable bits of information have not come from any question, but by keeping my mouth shut. She says, you get so much more information out of interactions when you simply give people the time and space to gather their thoughts. I think that's really, really powerful. And that relates to the fact how much listening is a gift from earlier in this talk. Give people space. That's what it means. One of the dimensions of being a good listener is to give people space and embrace silence. She also talks again about some cultural differences related to silence. Americans gab their way into bad bargaining positions during foreign trade negotiations all the time, she says. By remaining silent, you can learn about the other side's mood and willingness to compromise, as well as one of their walk-away issues, even just by how they frame the issue. As one expert said, and this is in her book, if you're not listening in a negotiation context, you're kind of screwed. She says, somehow lost in our self-promoting culture is the fact that you can't talk your way into a relationship. Silence is good. Silence is helpful. In addition to being respectful and culturally appropriate, more appropriate in certain cultures, silence is good. Silence is what allows other people in, as she says. Silence is what allows other people in. So just in brief conclusion here, I would say that all of these really, really good suggestions about how to listen better are about self-awareness and practice. Where can we improve? Where have we been um, shifting rather than supporting? Where have we been interrupting? Where have we been um, not creating space and time for conversations? To be aware for these, to be pay attention, get feedback, including feedback from ourselves and evaluating how we're doing. Practice, and then hear feedback that we might get. So I've been, as I mentioned earlier, I've been focusing on supporting rather than shifting. And it's an interesting little inner exercise to keep focusing on, oh, let me ask a follow-up question. Let me learn more about why that's important to them. To have that sort of task focus for me quiets my mind a little bit. It gives me something to focus on, in addition to the content of what they're saying, of course, but it's a little game that I'm playing with myself to keep going deeper in the conversation. What I find is that I'm much less potentially bored. I'm much less anxious than I might otherwise be in conversation. I'm hearing more, I'm learning more, I'm becoming more patient. I'm becoming more patient. So I offer all this up to you as a resource. Again, the book is You're Not Listening, What You're Missing and Why It Matters by Kate Murphy. Would highly recommend it. And as always, please reach out to me with any questions or comments, or even just to brainstorm how you might use some of these ideas with yourself, with your teams, or otherwise. We'll see you next month. Thank you.